pray with me. Oh God, speak to us now through ancient story, perhaps even through these words, I humbly ask. Amen. So the saga of Joseph has me thinking about clothes. Clothes and what we choose to wear and what that says about us. In fact, we can often mark stages of our lives by the garments we adorned ourselves with in a particular time, perhaps a military uniform, or bell-bottoms, a high school varsity letter jacket, or parachute pants. When I was 6 years old, for over a year, I went through a phase where I was really taken with Popeye the Sailor Man. I really wanted to be Popeye the Sailor Man, and so I wore a sailor hat every day, at all times, no matter what the occasion. I usually had a bubble pipe in the back of my pocket as well, just in case, for over a year. Except for when I was sleeping. Now, if the story of my life were told in clothes, then the sailor hat would have its entire own chapter. These things that we put on our bodies say something about us. They say something about a period of our lives that we were in at the time, and usually we have to shed them to move into whatever the next thing is for us. We have to shed these over time to grow up into what we are evolving into. Now, Joseph has an interesting relationship with clothes. They seem to keep betraying him, getting him into trouble when he is innocent. He keeps being forced to shed his skin, i.e. his outer garment, and move into the next phase for himself, whether or not he wants to. There was, of course, the famous coat of many colors that stirred the jealousy of his brothers and was the cause of him being sold into slavery in Egypt. And then again in our story today, in this incident with Potiphar's wife, it was his garment that he left behind as he escaped her advances that was used to frame him for something that he was innocent of. His first garment landed him in slavery. The second garment landed him in prison. Both times he was preyed upon, while he himself had done no wrong. And both times, God was with him. The text tells us that it was God's hesed, which means steadfast love. God's steadfast love was with Joseph throughout the ordeals, and that God had blessed them, so whatever he did really well. And he was noted for his abilities and his trustworthiness. And I have to wonder, with all this talk of blessing, I have to wonder if Joseph was especially blessed by God, or he just had a particularly strong trust in his blessedness. The Old Testament is full of stories about the youngest or the second-born sons who are especially beloved. Now, this emphasis on the youngest or the second-born one being really special, this flies in the face of the culture of the time, which prized the firstborn always as greater than all the others. But God had a different view. In our stories, it's almost always the lesser-noticed son that is shown favor in God's eyes, precisely because the culture did not. And it's not because God actually favors the younger one more than the older one, but it's that God goes out of God's way to show how the younger one is favored, because the blessing of the firstborn was never in question. The firstborn had all the inheritance and all that came with it. There was nothing else he needed. But this wasn't so for the younger one, which is precisely why God shines the spotlight on that one so that he could not be easily ignored. Now we see this, God's favor towards the younger one. We see this with Abel, with Jacob, with Joseph, and with David. And then continuing on into the New Testament with the story of the two brothers of the prodigal son. God lets it be known that those of less power and status will be favored to have equally what is assumed to be only the right of the firstborn. And maybe that's why Joseph seems to have such trust in God and in God's presence with him, because he didn't feel entitled to it. He hadn't earned it, so he couldn't unearn it. He simply knew it was a gift. Joseph is, of course, a complicated figure, and it's a complicated story. And there's a line through it that we cannot deny, that Joseph's story is a story of simple faithfulness over the long haul. And yet, I have to wonder, with all of these turn of events in Joseph's life that have this dire effect on him, how does he not become bitter? We never see that in Joseph. We don't sense bitterness from him. And I would like to think that maybe if these sorts of things were happening to me, that I would also be like Joseph. But I have to say, I'm pretty sure I would have some questions for God. I'm pretty sure I would feel like I deserved better. I would certainly probably ask the question, why me? I'd probably feel like God had abandoned me. And I'm sure I would be just a little bit angry. Now, I think Joseph probably was angry, and that he was more human than our story lets on to. Anger is good and healthy when it has its place. Anger can empower us for action, and it can help us change things that need changing. But what's different about Joseph is that he didn't let his anger foster or fester into bitterness. When anger festers into bitterness, it no longer serves us. It can only separate us. It is its own poison. Long-term bitterness can literally kill us. It can affect metabolism, organ function, and immune response. Bitterness can be the direct cause of the shortening of our lives. So what is it that Joseph has that does not lead him to swallow this pill of bitterness? Well, it seems to me that Joseph doesn't seem to keep score. He doesn't view life as a competition to be won. He doesn't keep a tally of points weighed by what seems fair and unfair to him. What we see is that as best he can, when things get really hard, he just does the next right thing. Joseph doesn't let circumstances or what others have done to him define his worth. He doesn't believe that he's entitled or better or worse than others. He simply believes that his worth is defined by God and God alone. And these qualities ultimately allow Joseph to be forgiving. And that's the end of Joseph's story when he meets his brothers again, the ones who sold him into slavery. He has accumulated quite a bit of power, and he chooses to use it for good rather than to harm them, though they had done him a great deal of wrong. So how do we not become bitter? Or how do we free ourselves from this toxicity? Well, I think a big key of this is to not hang on to resentments. It doesn't mean glossing over things or ignoring them, but honoring the harm that might have been done by working through it, and then not letting it have power over you anymore. Not being bitter means being in the moment that you are in rather than replaying the past in your mind or fixating on a future where you finally come out on top, but being in the now. And maybe the best antidote to bitterness is to increase our understanding and empathy towards others, especially those that it's really hard to do that with. What if we could all trust our blessedness in the way that it seems that Joseph trusted his? What if we could be freed from any sense that we must earn God's blessings or prove our blessedness, defend it, or compete for it? What if we could be spared the pill of bitterness? Friends, the blessing Joseph had from God is no different and no better than the blessing that we have from God. The difference, though, is that Joseph knew how to rest in that blessing. So maybe we can indeed be a little bit more like Joseph in the way that he trusted God's hesed, God's steadfast love for him. The more that we do the same, we realize that we can't earn God's love or blessing. The more we do that, the more we know we don't need to be perfect or defensive, and we also don't need to only look out for ourselves, because we can live in grace and plenty, knowing that the more we give the blessing away, the more we live in the blessing. And in this way, we shed our skin or ego. We shed the things that are used to define us over and over, much like shedding a garment. And we can live into the one thing that matters, the one thing that lasts, the one thing that actually does come out on top in the end always, which is only and ever love. Amen.